The morning sun gleamed off the polished glass windows of Westwood Luxury Motors, casting sharp reflections across the row of meticulously arranged luxury vehicles inside. Bentleys, Ferraris, and Aston Martins sat like royalty on velvet carpets, their sleek designs promising speed, power, and wealth. Each vehicle had a price tag that could rival the value of an upscale home. This was not a place for dreamers, it was a sanctuary for the elite. The glass doors slid open with a soft chime, and Olivia Hartman stepped inside. She wore a plain white t-shirt tucked into faded blue jeans, her sneakers scuffed from countless walks along Boston's cobblestone streets. Her brown hair, tied loosely in a ponytail, barely brushed her shoulders. There was no jewelry on her fingers, no designer purse slung across her arm. Olivia's presence didn't match the carefully cultivated image of exclusivity that Westwood prided itself on. Several employees near the reception desk paused mid-conversation, their eyes flicking toward her before exchanging amused glances. Lost? Someone muttered under their breath. Oblivious to the whispers, Olivia moved with quiet confidence, her gaze scanning the showroom floor. She had a purpose, one she refused to let their judgment shake. Her eyes landed on a sleek, silver coupe perched on a raised platform, a Linford Executive Coupe, limited edition, worth nearly $280,000. Perfect. It was exactly what she'd come for, a gift for her younger brother, Ryan, who had just won his long battle against leukemia. After years of painful treatments, hospital stays, and uncertainty, Ryan's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Olivia wanted to celebrate his courage with something unforgettable. Money wasn't an issue. She could afford that car 100 times over. But no one at Westwood Luxury Motors knew that. From across the showroom, Greg Stanton, the dealership's sales manager, adjusted his signature navy suit. The gold watch on his wrist gleamed beneath the lights, and his blue silk tie was knotted with precision. Greg prided himself on knowing who belonged in this showroom, and who didn't. He saw Olivia, and immediately made up his mind. "Here we go," Greg muttered to one of his associates with a smug grin. Ignoring Greg, Olivia approached a young salesman named Ryan Monroe, a fresh-faced employee whose ill-fitting suit suggested he was still learning the ropes. "Good morning," Ryan greeted her politely. "Is there something I can help you with today?" Before Olivia could answer, Greg materialized beside him. "I'll take it from here," he said firmly, flashing a tight smile at Olivia that barely concealed his irritation. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Olivia met his gaze calmly. "Actually," she replied, her voice steady, "I'm interested in that silver coupe over there." Greg's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "The Linford Executive?" He chuckled dryly. "That's a limited edition model, only 10 made this year. It's not exactly what we'd call a starter car." Olivia's smile didn't waver. "I'd still like to know more about it." Greg's grin widened, but this time it was colder. To him, this was no longer customer service, it was sport. He knew exactly how this was going to play out. And in his mind, there was only one winner. "Sure," Greg sneered. "But I doubt it's worth your time." The tension in the showroom thickened as Greg Stanton's smug smile widened. He was in his element now, ready to put this so-called customer in her place. "I'll tell you what," Greg said, barely masking his condescension. "Why don't I show you something a little more reasonable?" He gestured toward a row of pre-owned sedans lined up near the back of the showroom. "We've got some great options that might be more suitable." Olivia's smile never wavered. "I'm only interested in the Linford Executive Coupe," she repeated firmly. Greg's eyes narrowed. His patience was wearing thin, and he didn't bother to hide it. "Look," he sighed dramatically. "That car starts at $280,000. It's not exactly a first-time buyer kind of vehicle. People don't just wander in off the street and buy something like that." He gestured vaguely at her outfit. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable looking at something in our used inventory?" Behind Greg, a pair of sales associates stifled a chuckle. Olivia noticed, but she kept her composure. Years of running her foundation had taught her to keep calm under pressure, even when she was being underestimated. "I appreciate your concern," Olivia said steadily. "But I'd really like to take a closer look at the Linford Executive." Greg scoffed. "The Linford is by appointment only," he lied. "We don't just let anyone climb in and leave fingerprints all over a six-figure vehicle." The jab wasn't subtle. Olivia could feel the weight of the eyes now gathering around the room. Customers, sales staff, even the receptionist, were watching the scene unfold. I understand, Olivia replied, her voice still calm. I'd be happy to make an appointment. Greg shook his head. Appointments are typically reserved for serious buyers, he shot back. I am a serious buyer, Olivia said, her patience beginning to thin. Greg let out a sharp laugh, loud enough to turn a few more heads. A serious buyer? He repeated mockingly. Ma'am, I don't mean to be rude, but, he motioned up and down at her casual outfit. People who buy these kinds of cars, they don't exactly show up in jeans and sneakers. Olivia felt her face flush, not from embarrassment, but from frustration. Frustration that this wasn't the first time someone had judged her like this. I'd like to speak to the manager, Olivia said evenly. Greg's smile widened. I am the manager, he said smugly. So, if you don't mind, I have real customers to attend to. At that moment, a couple dressed in designer suits and carrying branded shopping bags strolled into the showroom. Greg's entire demeanor changed. He straightened his tie, smoothed his jacket, and practically sprinted over to greet them. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington. Greg beamed, his voice practically dripping with charm. So great to see you again. Let me show you the Linford executive you were asking about. Olivia's eyes widened. The same car that Greg claimed was by appointment only? Now he was inviting the Harringtons to sit inside it without a second thought. She glanced toward Ryan Monroe, the young salesman who had first greeted her. He stood awkwardly nearby, looking deeply uncomfortable. Olivia caught his eye. Would you mind telling me about the Linford? She asked softly. Ryan hesitated, glancing nervously toward Greg, who was now fawning over the Harringtons like they were royalty. Sure, Ryan said cautiously, stepping closer. In a quiet voice, he began explaining the Linford's features. Its hand-stitched leather seats, the custom-built engine, the state-of-the-art infotainment system. But Olivia wasn't listening. Her eyes remained fixed on Greg, as he theatrically held the Linford's door open for Mrs. Harrington to step inside. Olivia clenched her jaw. That's all right, she said to Ryan, her voice tight. I understand how things work around here. Greg's voice rang out from across the showroom. This particular model has an 8-month waiting list, he declared proudly. But for you too. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that Olivia could still hear. I've set aside this one specifically for our special clients. The couple murmured appreciatively as Mrs. Harrington settled into the plush leather seat. Olivia stepped closer, now standing just within earshot. Excuse me, she said firmly. Greg's smile froze. He turned sharply, irritation flashing across his face. I was hoping to inquire about purchasing this model, Olivia said evenly. Greg's professional mask slipped entirely. I already told you, he snapped. This vehicle is being shown to these customers. The Harringtons exchanged an awkward glance, sensing the tension. I'm specifically interested in this car, Olivia repeated. For my brother's birthday. Greg stepped away from the Harringtons, lowering his voice to a sharp whisper. Look, he hissed. I get it. People like to daydream. But this is a place of business, and that car costs more than most homes. Now, I've been patient, but you're wasting my time and embarrassing yourself. By now, several customers had stopped browsing to watch the uncomfortable exchange unfold. Olivia felt her heart pound. I'm prepared to make a cash purchase today, Olivia said calmly. That was the breaking point. Greg barked out a short, harsh laugh that echoed through the showroom. A cash purchase? He repeated loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. Lady, this isn't a yard sale. People who can afford these cars. He gestured dismissively at her worn-out sneakers. Don't dress like that. The room fell silent. Olivia could feel every set of eyes locked on her. For a moment, she considered walking away, leaving Greg to wallow in his arrogance. But then she remembered Ryan's embarrassed expression, and thought about her brother, Ryan, who had fought so hard to survive. I believe my money is as good as anyone else's, she said quietly. Greg stepped closer, towering over her now. Let me be clear, he said, his voice low and sharp. Either make an appointment for a serious discussion, dressed appropriately, or leave. The room stayed silent as Olivia stood her ground. Her face burned, but her pride remained intact. I see, she said softly. With her dignity unshaken, Olivia turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, Greg's smug voice rang out just loud enough for her to hear. Some people just don't know their place. As Olivia stepped into the morning sunlight, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the contact list. It wasn't about revenge, she reminded herself. It was about something bigger. She dialed. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Ethan, she said quietly, her voice steady. I need you to do something for me. The morning sun bathed the sleek showroom windows of Westwood Luxury Motors in a golden glow. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet confidence. Sales associates adjusted their ties, polished their name tags, and stood ready to cater to their elite clientele. At the heart of the dealership, Greg Stanton was still basking in the previous day's encounter. Can you believe that woman? Greg chuckled to a colleague. Thought she could waltz in here looking like that, and walk out with a six-figure car. He shook his head. Some people just don't know when they're out of their league. His colleague snorted in agreement. Yeah, well, people like that always want to act like they belong. Greg straightened his signature navy suit, adjusting the gold watch on his wrist with smug precision. He was untouchable here, the top salesman, the trusted manager. He knew who belonged in a showroom like this, and more importantly, who didn't. That's why his smile faltered when a Rolls-Royce Phantom, gleaming silver with a custom chrome finish, rolled silently to a stop right in front of the dealership's entrance. The car's sleek body glistened like liquid metal, reflecting the morning light. Even Greg, a man accustomed to luxury, felt his pulse quicken. The uniformed chauffeur stepped out first, crisp white gloves tugging the door handle with precision. The back passenger door opened, and Ethan Hartman emerged. He was tall, sharp-featured, and impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that whispered quiet power. His salt and pepper hair was combed back neatly, and the platinum cufflinks on his shirt glinted subtly in the light. His presence commanded attention. Conversations among employees stopped. A few customers pretended not to stare but couldn't resist glancing his way. Greg's instincts kicked in. This was the kind of client that defined success. Someone who didn't just want a luxury car, he wanted an entire fleet. Mr. Stanton, Greg muttered under his breath, smoothing his tie as he strode confidently toward the man. He reached Ethan before any other salesperson had the chance. Good morning, sir, Greg said with a broad smile, extending his hand. Welcome to Westwood Luxury Motors. Greg Stanton, sales manager, and might I say, you've got impeccable taste. That Phantom is absolutely stunning. Ethan accepted Greg's handshake firmly, but his smile was thin and cold. I appreciate that, Ethan said smoothly. But I'm actually here for something else. Of course, Greg said eagerly. We've just received a new shipment of high-performance Bentleys and Astons. I'd be happy to show you. I'm here about the Linford Executive Coupe, Ethan interrupted. His voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. Greg's smile widened. Ah, excellent choice. A rare model, only 10 available this year. I'd be more than happy to show it to you. Ethan's expression darkened. You don't need to show it to me, he said coolly. My wife was here yesterday. Olivia Hartman? Greg's smile froze. Your wife? He repeated, suddenly unsure of himself. Yes, Ethan confirmed. She came in yesterday to purchase the Linford as a gift from my brother-in-law. His gaze locked onto Greg's. You remember her, don't you? Greg swallowed hard, his mouth opened, but no words came out. You turned her away, Ethan continued, his voice low but firm. Told her she wasn't serious enough to buy a car like that. Suggested she check out your used inventory instead. By now, the showroom had gone quiet. Sales staff watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Even Patrick Monroe, the dealership's owner, had emerged from his office, sensing trouble. Mr. Hartman, Greg began, forcing a nervous chuckle. There must have been some sort of misunderstanding. We welcome all customers here at Westwood. No, Ethan said flatly. There was no misunderstanding. His cold stare never wavered. Patrick cleared his throat and stepped forward. Mr. Hartman, he said with a forced smile. I'm sure we can resolve this. If you'd like to discuss, I'll make this very simple, Ethan interrupted. His calm demeanor had shifted, now there was unmistakable steel in his voice. I was planning to purchase the Linford Executive Coupe for my wife's brother. But I was also considering replacing our company's entire fleet. 7 vehicles total. And he paused for effect. I've been meaning to add a few new models to my personal collection. Patrick's face lit up. A deal like that could cover their sales targets for the entire quarter. But Ethan's gaze shifted back to Greg. Unfortunately, Ethan continued, I'm not sure this is the right dealership for that investment. After all, his tone darkened. If your staff can't treat my wife with respect, I don't see how I can trust them to handle my business. The silence in the showroom was deafening. Mr. Hartman, please, Patrick stammered. I assure you this doesn't reflect our values. We'd be honored to earn your business. Ethan paused, watching Patrick squirm. Then, finally, he said, there might be a way forward. Patrick's face brightened with relief. Of course, anything you need. Ethan turned back to Greg, his eyes hard. I believe your sales manager here could benefit from some perspective, Ethan said coldly. The Hartman Foundation is hosting a fundraiser next month to support children with autism. We're always looking for volunteers. Perhaps Mr. Stanton should consider lending a hand. Greg's face drained of color. Sir, Greg stammered, I don't think that's, not as a guest, Ethan interrupted. As a volunteer. Helping with setup, serving guests, and working directly with the families our foundation supports. Patrick jumped in immediately. Absolutely, Greg will be there. Consider it done. Ethan turned to Ryan Monroe, the young salesman who had treated Olivia with kindness. I'd like you to handle all the paperwork, Ethan said, surprising the young man. Starting with the Linford executive for my brother-in-law. Ryan's eyes widened. Yes, sir. I'd be honored. Ethan nodded. His work here was done. Without another glance at Greg, he turned and walked toward the exit, pausing just long enough to run his fingers along the sleek silver finish of the Phantom. My wife has excellent taste, he murmured. As the Rolls-Royce disappeared down the street, Greg stood frozen in place. His perfect world, the one built on judgment, arrogance, and appearances, had just crumbled before his eyes. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Greg Stanton would learn what humility truly meant. The morning of the Hartman Foundation Gala arrived, with an air of uneasy tension for Greg Stanton. For the past 2 weeks, he had stewed in frustration, dreading this moment. Volunteering at a charity event wasn't just humiliating, it felt like punishment. And worse, it wasn't the kind of punishment he could brush off with a smug smile and a well-timed joke. Dressed in a plain black event staff uniform, no gold watch, no silk tie, no expensive cologne, Greg felt exposed. The crisp, high-end suits and dazzling jewelry worn by the gala guests only made him feel smaller. He wasn't here as a manager anymore. He was just another worker, forgotten, overlooked, insignificant. Excuse me, sir? A woman's voice startled him. Greg turned to see a young mother struggling to push a wheelchair through the entrance. The boy in the chair, Thomas, was no older than 10, with bright blue eyes and a contagious smile. A brace supported his thin legs, and Greg noticed the boy's hands shook slightly as he adjusted his wristband. Would you mind giving me a hand? The mother asked, her face weary but warm. Greg forced a smile, a far cry from the confident grin he wore at Westwood Luxury Motors. He stepped forward and gently helped maneuver Thomas's wheelchair over the carpeted threshold. Thanks. Thomas beamed. I'm Thomas. Greg knelt beside him. Nice to meet you, Thomas, he said quietly. I'm Greg. Are you a coach? Thomas asked eagerly. They said some volunteers are helping with basketball today. Greg's smile faltered. Basketball? He hadn't signed up for that. He assumed he'd be greeting guests, stacking chairs, simple tasks that didn't involve actual interaction. I guess one am, Greg said hesitantly. Awesome. Thomas grinned wide. Don't worry, I'll show you how it's done. For the first hour, Greg stumbled through his volunteer duties. He set up tables, refilled drinks, and directed guests as best he could. All the while, he tried to avoid the basketball court. But then, halfway through the afternoon, Thomas found him again. Come on, Coach Greg. Thomas called across the room, waving him over. Greg sighed, reluctantly walking to the court where a group of kids in wheelchairs were practicing. Their joy was infectious. Shouts of excitement echoed across the gym as they passed the ball, called plays, and cheered each other on. I don't really know how this works, Greg muttered. That's okay, Thomas grinned. I'll teach you. And to Greg's surprise, Thomas did. For the next hour, Greg learned the rules of adaptive basketball, how to pass, how to block, and how to maneuver in a wheelchair himself. Thomas was patient, far more patient than Greg deserved. Keep your elbows in, Thomas called. Stop shooting like a T-Rex. The kids roared with laughter, and to Greg's own surprise, so did he. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about sales targets, commissions, or closing deals, he was just present. After practice, Thomas wheeled over to him, face glowing with excitement. You did great. Thomas grinned. You're way better than my mom thought you'd be. Greg chuckled. Wait, your mom didn't think I'd be any good. Nope, Thomas said, shrugging. She said you looked too serious. Greg laughed again, not out of arrogance, but because it was true. He had been too serious for too long. As the gala neared its end, Greg found himself at a quiet corner of the room, observing the families, the children, and the volunteers mingling. He spotted Olivia Hartman, elegant yet understated in a navy blue gown, chatting with guests. For a moment, Greg considered slipping away unnoticed. But then he saw Thomas wave to him from across the room, and Greg knew what he had to do. He approached Olivia with purpose. She turned, her expression calm but guarded. Mrs. Hartman, Greg began, his voice quieter than usual. I wanted to apologize. Olivia's brow arched slightly. I know I treated you poorly at Westwood, Greg said, forcing himself to hold her gaze. I assumed a lot of things. He paused, searching for the right words. And I was wrong. For a moment, Olivia said nothing. Then, finally, she spoke. You're right, she said simply. You were wrong. Greg winced. He expected her words to sting, but instead, they felt honest. Fair. But, Olivia continued, her tone softening. I hear Thomas has taken a liking to you. Greg smiled sheepishly. He's a good coach. He's a tough coach, Olivia corrected with a smile. But he's a great judge of character. Greg swallowed hard. I know I can't undo what I did, but I've been working with Mr. Monroe at Westwood to make some changes. He paused. We're starting a new customer training program. One that doesn't involve judging people by their clothes. For the first time, Olivia's expression softened fully. That's a good start, she said. Greg nodded. I know I still have a lot to learn. Well, Olivia smiled. Thomas can teach you. Just don't forget to keep your elbows in. They both laughed, and for the first time in a long while, Greg felt lighter, like a burden had finally been lifted. Later that night, Greg helped Thomas back into his wheelchair after a photo session. The boy grinned up at him. You know what, Mr. Greg, Thomas said. You're pretty cool. For a grown-up. Greg chuckled. Coming from you, Thomas, that's the best compliment I've ever gotten. And this time, Greg knew he truly meant it. For the next few weeks, Greg Stanton found himself in unfamiliar territory, both literally and emotionally. His experience at the Hartman Foundation Gala had left a mark that refused to fade. Gone was the smug sense of superiority that had once defined him. In its place lingered something far more unsettling, self-reflection. At first, Greg convinced himself that volunteering was just a formality, a way to clean up his image, to ensure Ethan Hartman didn't ruin his career. But something unexpected happened. The faces he once ignored, the people he once dismissed, were now impossible to overlook. Every Saturday morning, Greg found himself back at the Hartman Foundation's sports facility, where children with disabilities practiced adaptive basketball, soccer, and even dance routines. What started as an obligation soon became a quiet ritual, one Greg secretly looked forward to. Back again? Olivia Hartman teased one afternoon as Greg walked into the gym, dressed in casual clothes rather than his signature suit. Apparently, Greg muttered with a sheepish smile. Thomas said I needed more practice. He's not wrong, Olivia chuckled, her tone no longer sharp but warm. That morning, Greg joined the kids on the court again, this time with far less hesitation. Thomas led the way, guiding Greg through drills with all the confidence of a seasoned coach. Don't rush it, Mr. Greg, Thomas called out as Greg fumbled another pass. "You're thinking too much, just play." And so Greg tried. He forgot about looking foolish. He forgot about protecting his pride. He just played. By the end of the session, he was drenched in sweat, laughing alongside the kids as they celebrated their scrimmage victory. It wasn't just the game that had changed him, it was the kids themselves. Their determination, their spirit. It humbled him in a way that nothing else had. A new routine, and a new purpose back at Westwood Luxury Motors. Greg found himself noticing things he once ignored. The way newer employees hesitated before approaching customers who didn't fit the typical luxury car buyer mold. The way certain clients received warmer greetings based solely on their expensive shoes or designer watches. And worst of all, the way he had once encouraged that behavior. One afternoon, Greg pulled aside Ryan Monroe, the young salesman who had defended Olivia on her first visit. "I need your help with something," Greg said. Ryan blinked in surprise. "Sure. What do you need?" "I want to change the way we qualify customers," Greg said firmly. "Starting now. No more snap judgments based on appearances. I want every client treated the same, whether they walk in wearing a three-piece suit or sneakers." Ryan's eyes widened. "Wow, okay, yeah, I'm in." Together, they began implementing small but meaningful changes. Greg introduced new customer service protocols, emphasizing respect, empathy, and patience. He encouraged the team to spend more time learning about their clients, their stories, their reasons for purchasing a car, rather than making assumptions based on first impressions. It wasn't easy. Some employees resisted, quietly mocking Greg behind his back. But Greg no longer cared. He knew now that respect had to be earned, not demanded. A test of character, the true test, came one rainy afternoon. A man in faded jeans and an old leather jacket wandered into the showroom. His hair was messy, and his boots were scuffed. A few employees snickered as he slowly walked past the luxury cars. Greg watched from a distance, feeling a sharp pang of guilt. This is exactly the kind of customer I used to ignore. Determined not to repeat his mistakes, Greg approached the man with a genuine smile. "Good afternoon," Greg greeted. "Anything I can help you with?" The man looked surprised, and then cautious, as if expecting sarcasm. "I was just looking," the man muttered. "Didn't want to waste your time." "You're not wasting my time," Greg said sincerely. "Take your time. Let me know if you have any questions." Greg stepped back, letting the man explore without pressure. 10 minutes later, the man returned, pointing to a sleek black Aston Martin Vantage on the showroom floor. "That one," the man said, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. "I'll take it." Greg hesitated. "That model starts at $200,000, he said carefully. The man chuckled softly and reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick envelope of cash, enough to pay in full. "I've been saving for years," the man said, his voice quieter now. "My brother passed away last year. We always said we'd buy matching cars when we retired. So, I figured I'd keep that promise." Greg's throat tightened. "Let me get the paperwork started," he said softly. When the transaction was complete, Greg personally walked the man to his new car, holding the umbrella to keep him dry. "Thank you for trusting us," Greg said as the man climbed inside. The man gave a small smile. "Most places wouldn't have given me the time of day," he muttered. "But you did." The final lesson later that evening. Greg sat quietly in his office, reflecting on the day. His thoughts drifted back to Thomas, the boy who had shown him that worth wasn't measured in wealth or status. It was measured in kindness, resilience, and respect. Just before closing, Ryan poked his head into Greg's office. "Hey," Ryan grinned. "That guy who bought the Aston Martin? He said to tell you, you're a pretty cool guy." Greg smiled faintly. "Coming from him?" Greg murmured. "That's the best compliment I've had in a long time." For the first time in his career, Greg Stanton realized that success wasn't about numbers, quotas, or appearances. It was about people. And this time, Greg knew he was finally getting it right. The soft chime of the showroom door echoed through Westwood Luxury Motors, one crisp afternoon. Greg Stanton, now a changed man, instinctively glanced up from his desk. His eyes widened when he saw her, Olivia Hartman, stepping through the glass doors. For a moment, Greg froze. Memories of their last encounter, his arrogance, his mocking tone, His humiliating laughter came rushing back like a wave. Olivia, dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer over a simple white blouse, looked calm and composed, yet unmistakably confident. Greg took a steady breath and rose from his chair. "Ryan," Greg called quietly to the young salesman at the front desk. "I'll handle this one." Ryan's eyebrows shot up, but he nodded and stepped back. Greg straightened his shirt and walked toward Olivia. His heart pounded in his chest, but for once, it wasn't out of pride, it was nerves. "Mrs. Hartman," Greg began, his voice low but sincere. I'm really glad you're here." Olivia's expression remained neutral. "Are you?" she asked coolly. "Yes," Greg said quickly. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to deal with, but I've been hoping for a chance to speak with you." He paused, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "If you'd be willing to hear me out." Olivia folded her arms. "I'm listening." Greg cleared his throat. The words didn't come easily, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew no apology could fully erase what had happened. Still, he had to try. "I owe you an apology," Greg said, voice steady, "for how I treated you that day, for assuming you didn't belong here, and for embarrassing you in front of all those people." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong, completely wrong, and I regret it more than you know." Olivia's eyes softened slightly, but she said nothing. Greg continued. "That day, it changed me." His voice grew quieter. "I've spent the past few weeks volunteering at your foundation. I've seen firsthand what you've built, the lives you've changed, and I get it now." He exhaled deeply. "I get why Ethan wanted me to be there. I needed to see what real strength, real value, and real character looked like." He paused, watching for a reaction. Olivia remained silent, but her arms had lowered slightly. "I also heard you've been working with the kids at the foundation," Olivia finally said. "Thomas seems to think you're a future basketball star." Greg chuckled softly. "Thomas gives me too much credit. Honestly, I've learned more from him than I ever thought possible. That kid." He shook his head, smiling. "Point he's something special." For the first time, Olivia smiled. "I know," she said warmly. Encouraged, Greg pressed on. "I've also been working to fix things here," he added. "We've changed our customer policies, no more judging people by their clothes or their appearance. Everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect." Olivia arched a brow. "That's a big change coming from you." Greg smiled ruefully. "Yeah. Turns out it takes one bad decision to realize just how wrong you've been." There was a pause, the air between them no longer tense, but reflective. "I can't undo what happened," Greg said at last, "but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, and I'm really sorry for how I treated you." For a moment, Olivia said nothing. Greg braced himself, prepared for her to walk away, dismiss him, or say something sharp in return. He wouldn't blame her, he deserved that. Instead, Olivia surprised him. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate your apology." Greg blinked. "You do?" "I do," Olivia nodded, "but I didn't come here for that." Greg's stomach tightened. "Oh?" Olivia reached into her purse and pulled out a sleek leather envelope. "I came to give you this," she said, handing it to him. Greg opened it cautiously, pulling out an elegantly embossed invitation. "The Hartman Foundation Annual Gala," he read aloud. "We're hosting it next month," Olivia explained. "Ethan and I would like you to attend, as our guest." Greg blinked in disbelief. I don't understand." "Why?" "Because you've changed," Olivia said simply. "Thomas says you're different now, and I trust his judgment." Greg felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent weeks trying to make things right, but he never expected this. "Forgiveness. I'd be honored," he said quietly. "Good," Olivia smiled. "But Thomas says you're still terrible at free throws, so expect some practice before then." They both laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound. The night of the gala 1 month later, Greg stood at the entrance of the Hartman Foundation Gala, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit. He still wasn't entirely comfortable in rooms filled with powerful people. But tonight, that didn't matter. Thomas spotted him from across the room, racing over in his wheelchair. "Coach Greg." Thomas grinned. "You made it." Greg knelt beside him. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, kid." Thomas glanced toward the stage where Olivia and Ethan Hartman stood, preparing to speak. "You know what? Thomas whispered conspiratorially. I think you're gonna fit in just fine. Greg chuckled. Thanks, Thomas. Coming from you, that means everything. As Greg stood to join the crowd, he glanced across the room at Olivia. Their eyes met, and this time, there was no tension, only mutual respect. Greg Stanton had learned the hardest lesson of his life, that true worth isn't defined by appearance, wealth, or status. It's measured by how you treat others, especially when no one important is watching. And this time, Greg knew he had finally gotten it right. The Hartman Foundation Gala was in full swing, the grand ballroom aglow with soft amber lighting. Laughter and conversation filled the air, and guests in elegant attire moved between tables, exchanging smiles and warm greetings. For Greg Stanton, the evening felt strangely different, not because of the luxury surrounding him, but because for once, he wasn't pretending to belong. He stood near the back of the room, observing the crowd. Olivia and Ethan Hartman stood on stage, addressing the audience. Olivia's voice rang with quiet confidence as she spoke about the foundation's mission, supporting children with disabilities and empowering families to thrive. Greg found himself nodding along, genuinely moved by her words. This foundation wouldn't be what it is today without people willing to stand up, listen, and learn, Olivia said from the podium. Her gaze swept the room before landing, intentionally, on Greg. Even those who've had to learn the hard way, she added with a small smile. Greg chuckled softly. He knew that was for him. Moments later, applause erupted as Olivia and Ethan stepped away from the stage. The night continued, guests mingling, donors pledging support. Yet Greg found himself drawn to the corner of the room where Thomas was chatting excitedly with a group of kids. Coach Greg, Thomas called out, spotting him. Get over here. Greg smiled and walked over, greeted by a round of enthusiastic waves from the children. You know, Thomas said with mock seriousness, I told these guys you're a terrible basketball player. The kids giggled. Well, you're not wrong, Greg admitted with a laugh. But I'm getting better. Barely, Thomas shot back, grinning. Greg knelt beside him, lowering his voice. Hey, I wanted to thank you. Thomas tilted his head. For what? For putting up with me, Greg said quietly. For teaching me to loosen up. And for reminding me that I don't know as much as I thought I did. Thomas's smile widened. Yeah, he said proudly. I get that a lot. Greg laughed, but then his tone turned serious. I mean it, Greg said. I've spent years thinking respect had to be earned through power or success. That people like me were the ones who decided who was important and who wasn't. He paused, glancing around the room, at the children, the families, the volunteers who had given so much of their time and energy to make this event happen. But I was wrong, Greg continued. Respect isn't something you hand out when you decide someone deserves it. It's something you give. To everyone, no matter what. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, his expression wise beyond his years. Yeah, he said. My mom says respect is like kindness. You don't get to pick and choose who's worthy of it. Greg smiled. She's a smart lady, Thomas grinned. I know. A surprising opportunity later that evening. Greg found himself in conversation with Ethan Hartman. The normally stoic businessman now seemed far more approachable. So, Ethan said, sipping his drink, Olivia tells me you've been working with Ryan Monroe to change things at Westwood. Greg nodded. Yeah. It's not perfect yet, but we're getting there. Ethan's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Tell me something, he said. Why did you stick with it? Greg considered the question. Because I knew I had to, he admitted. I hurt someone, your wife, and I couldn't just move on pretending I didn't. Most people would have, Ethan said. Yeah, Greg nodded. But honestly, meeting Thomas, volunteering at the foundation, it changed me. Those kids. His voice trailed off. They don't complain. They don't make excuses. They just show up every day and give it everything they've got. Greg paused, then added quietly, if they can do that, so can I. Ethan studied him for a moment, then smiled. You know, Ethan said thoughtfully, we've been thinking about adding a volunteer coordinator for the foundation's programs, someone to help connect businesses and sponsors with the kids. Greg's brow lifted. You think I'd be good at that? Thomas does, Ethan said simply. And that's good enough for me. A new beginning 1 week later, Greg found himself standing on the polished hardwood floors of the Hartman Foundation's gymnasium. Dressed in sneakers and a plain t-shirt, no gold watch, no expensive suit, he felt strangely comfortable. Thomas rolled onto the court, holding a basketball in his lap. "All right, Coach Greg." Thomas grinned. "Time for your rematch." "Oh no," Greg groaned. "I've seen what you can do. I'm not